Shabbat Shalom. This is Daniel John Lee with Torah Restoration Ministries. It is the Sabbath, the seventh day of the week, the Shabbat, May the 6th, 2017. Can't believe it's already Omer 21. 3 weeks now into the countdown to Shavuot Pentecost from the Sabbath and Passover week, the day after Sabbath and Passover week. It's amazing. So this is part 4 of 17 of my teaching series on reconciling the teachings of Messiah, Yahshua, and Apostle Paul. Part 4, this is Romans 10 equals Deuteronomy 30. So this is a really amazing chapter that Paul writes in Romans chapter 10. Listen to what he says. He says, starting at the very beginning, he expresses his heart's desire that all Israel should be saved. And he acknowledges that many of these Israelites have a zeal, but not according to knowledge. That they're going about establishing their own righteousness. And why? Because what we saw in parts 2 and 3 is that the leadership, most of the leadership of the first century Jewish nation, what were they doing? They weren't following the written Torah out of a heart of love. They were creating their own man-made traditions and commandments and laws, their own, what they would call takanot, their own man-made instructions, many of which violated the Torah, and so they were establishing their own righteousness rather than following Yah's righteousness. And so Paul says, but Messiah, he is the end of the Torah for righteousness to everyone that believes. He's the goal. Actually, that word telos, goal, he's the goal. Messiah is the goal that the Torah points toward. For Moses describes the righteousness which is of the Torah, that the man which doeth those things shall live by them. In verse 6, that should be and, not but. Paul's not contrasting, and I'm going to prove this through what he writes later in this chapter. And the righteousness which is of faith speaks on this wise. Say not in your heart, who shall ascend into heaven, that is to bring Messiah down from above, or who shall descend into the deep, that is to bring up Messiah again from the dead. But what says it? The word is nigh thee, even in your mouth and in your heart, that is the word of faith which we preach. That if you will confess with your mouth that the Messiah Yahshua, and shall believe in your heart that Yah hath raised him up from the dead, you shall be saved. For with the heart man believes unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. Paul right there, he is quoting directly from Deuteronomy chapter 30. Deuteronomy chapter 30. This is the chapter where Moshe has given the Torah once again. In fact, Deuteronomy is all a book about recounting the entire Torah of Moshe. And at the very end of giving all the Torah once again, he says in Deuteronomy 30, right toward the end of the book, starting in verse 11, he says, for this commandment, or this Torah, which I command you this day, it is not hidden from thee, neither is it far off. It is not in heaven that you should say, who shall go up for us to heaven and bring it unto us, that we may hear it and do it? Neither is it beyond the sea, that you should say, who shall go over the sea for us and bring it unto us, that we may hear it and do it? But the word is very nigh unto you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it. So what is Apostle Paul very deliberately doing in Romans 10? He is directly quoting Deuteronomy 30, verses 11 through 14, and he's simply replacing commandment or Torah with Christ or Messiah. Why does he do this? Because the Messiah, Yahshua, is the Torah, clothed in flesh. They are one and the same. They are inseparable. He is showing that there's no difference. Just as Yah told the Israelites, hey, don't think that you can't do these commandments. This is not way over the sea that you have to say, oh, who's going to go? It's not way up in heaven, oh, who's going to go? He's saying, you can do this. This word is in your heart, in your mouth. You can obey this Torah. And in the same way, Paul's saying, Messiah. Don't say Messiah is way descended to the deep, or he's way up in heaven, but this word is near you. You can believe in him, which means to obey him. They're one and the same. Keeping the Torah and obeying Messiah are one and the same, and Paul's making this very clear by quoting directly from Deuteronomy 30 and simply replacing the word Torah or commandment with the word Messiah. Now, I said earlier I was going to prove that he's not contrasting believing in faith and obeying Torah. He's not contrasting that at all. And here's where I'm going to prove that. If you go a little farther in Romans 10, it says, starting in verse 15, it says, how shall they preach except they be sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of them that preach the gospel of shalom, of peace, and bring glad tidings of good things. But they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah says, Lord, who hath believed our report? So, do you catch that? Isaiah, way back in the times of Torah, was preaching the same gospel that Paul is preaching here in the first century. It's the same everlasting gospel. It's always been the same gospel since the beginning of time until now, 2017. And that gospel is simply this: you hearken to his voice and keep his commandments. You hearken to his voice and keep his commandments. It's never changed. The only thing that changed, and we'll go over this when we get into the parts later when we go through the book of Hebrews, the only thing that's changed is now Yahshua has shed his blood. He stamped the Torah in his blood. He's provided a huge moral inward incentive by our hearts being broken by what he did for us to now obey his commandments, so that these aren't just written on tablets of stone, but they're now in our hearts, that they're in our tablets of flesh. He's given us a heart of flesh rather than a heart of stone. And by the way, there were still people with hearts of flesh in the Torah times. I mean, we see that. We see Moshe was filled with the Spirit of Yah, and we see other examples of that throughout the Scriptures. But now it's happening en masse. It's happening with multitudes and multitudes, because back then their revelation was very limited. I mean, they were only looking very much into the distant future when one day Messiah would come. But here and now, and back in the first century, they had seen the fullness of Yah manifesting himself in the flesh through the image of himself, Yahshua. And now it was happening in much greater proportions, because Yahshua had now shed his blood. He had manifested himself to the world. You know, people say, when Yahshua says to his disciples, you know, a new thing I tell you, love each other as I have loved you. What was the new thing? Because the commandment to love is not new. That's in the Torah. It's in Deuteronomy, where it says, Hear, O Israel, love the Lord your Yah with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That was in the Torah, so that wasn't new. What was new? What was new was that Yah, at long last, had manifested himself in the flesh and shown how to walk out the Torah through love on this earth. That was what was new. And so that was what had changed. But this gospel was the same. This gospel was the same. So Paul, again, he's saying, man, these Jewish leaders, they're trying to go about establishing their own righteousness. They're doing their own man-made commandments, all these things that are against the Torah, just like many Christians do today in the 21st century, where they're going about establishing their own righteousness by changing the Sabbath to Sunday, by eating pork and shellfish, by keeping these pagan holidays like Easter and Christmas. That's their own righteousness, just like the Jews were creating their own righteousness. But they're not following the righteousness of Yah. They're not submitting to his righteousness. And Paul says, so what is that? And then he says, Christ, Messiah, obeying him, believing in him. And by the way, believing in him, believing in the heart is not just, it's just not a mental assent or confession. Believing in your heart means you're obeying Messiah. You've totally surrendered to him. And then he says, this righteousness of faith, don't say that it's way up in heaven. Just like Moses says, and this command which I command you, it's not hidden from thee. Don't say it's way up in heaven. And Paul again says, don't say Messiah is way in the depths, who's going to bring it over? Just like Moshe says, don't say this commandment's way across the sea, who's going to go get it for us? Because obeying this commandment, obeying the Torah, is the same as obeying Messiah. And then he even shows how the same gospel that Isaiah preached and many rejected is the same gospel Paul's now preaching now. Same one, the same everlasting gospel. So Romans 10 is a very beautiful chapter. It really, really does a good job showing the continuity between obeying the commandments and obeying the gospel that Paul's preaching. You can't get any more clear than this. I pray that this was a blessing. This is Daniel John Lee with Torah Restoration Ministries. Website is www.spiritandtorah.com. Shabbat Shalom.